and welcome to 1958. This is going to be a year of many X-plane flights. Almost all of our launches this year, 8 in total, are going to be taken up by X-plane flights. That's going to be 5 plane flights to 3 rocket launches. And here we have our first. This is the first test flight of the X-4, our newest X-plane. It is very serious business, of course, so we have Ernest Hall at the helm. His retirement date is currently set for sometime later this year. However, we are confident that we can push it back if we can get him into the cockpit of the X-4 and experiencing some rather daring heights. Of course, this was just a test flight, and now Ernest is coming down for a landing. Unfortunately, we underestimated the distance that this plane would need to cover in its flight, and so we are coming in very far from the KSC. Unfortunately, Ernest will not be able to touch down the X-4 on a runway, and will have to use the emergency parachute stowed on board in order to survive the landing. He is descending through the clouds now, and you can see it's quite a little scary almost. I'm sure Ernest is having a great time though, and here you can see he broke through the cloud layer finally. It's very dark on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. I guess a storm must have been brewing. And here Ernest realizes he cannot make it back, so he'll have to deploy that parachute and come down for a landing. And here we see a new thing that I'm going to be doing. All flights going forward after 1957, since we had completed our light satellites program, will be labeled by the vehicle that is being launched, the payload that's being launched, and then followed by the booster that is launching it. So if you see a name, say for example the Tayen 5, and then you see a name after that, the Ahote 600, that means that the Ahote 600 is the booster that is launching the Tayen 5. And here we are. This was the backup Tayen 5 for our final launch of 1957, the one launch that I had spoken about in the last episode, where we were going to have it stored as a backup in the event of a failure for the Tayen 5. Luckily, we did not encounter that failure, but one thing that you will note is that this rocket did fail, so something was wrong with this rocket that prevented its third stage from igniting, or its second stage, from igniting. And the Tayen 5 ended up being an altitude test. And welcome back. Here we are with the X-4. And we see yet another familiar face. After Ernest's flight in the X-4, we have Gwyn at the helm. Both Ernest and Gwyn were out of commission for almost all of last year, taking coursework related to our new cockpit that is on the X-4, and training for the following missions. Of course, the X-4 is a plane meant for high altitude, and so Gwyn intends to test that in this flight, going as high as possible. She will attempt an 85-kilometer altitude record. This is something that the older X2 cockpit that we had on our X3 plane would not been able to complete, as the altitude ceiling on that cockpit was 75 to 80 kilometers in altitude. And so here we are, inching ever closer to the Kármán line, the great barrier between Kerbelkind and the great unknown. Of course, the X4 will be able to breach that barrier come this year. But first, we have to take some small baby steps, starting with this 85-kilometer altitude record. And the perfect pilot that Gwyn is, she comes in for a perfect belly flop maneuver, coming down through the atmosphere, shedding off her speed, and coming in on a glide slope. Of course, this time they had dropped the plane from the carrier aircraft a little bit closer to the KSC. However, Gwyn notes that she will not be able to make it back based on her glide slope, and she decides to ditch in the ocean just as Ernest had earlier this year. Unfortunate, but I guess it will have to do. Here we are coming down for the landing. Of course, you know that Ernest and Gwyn aren't the only ones that can fly planes. So we had to get this old man back in the cockpit, and Stacy Wood is here for another flight. This is going to be his first in the X4 cockpit, and he is very excited to test out the limits of this aircraft. His contract that he is signed to complete here for this flight is going to be to cross the Kármán line and break that 100-kilometer altitude marker. We have him heading up there right now, and he's got a perfect angle on. Of course, he'll want to pitch up a little bit more before the very end, so that way he can get the most lift out of this plane. Those little stubby wings can barely lift it, so you have to stand on your heels in order to get this plane to actually go upwards. And you can see that Stacy is a crack pilot. Of course, he starts to level out his plane in preparation for hitting the 100-kilometer altitude marker, and Stacy takes a little bit of a jaunt around his cockpit just to feel the low gravity of this maneuver. Of course, he begins to slowly drift downwards after reaching an altitude record of 120 kilometers, breaking even what was expected of him. Of course, we can always expect Stacy Wood to outperform what was asked of him when the administrators gave him their contract. One thing we can note is that he did not perform quite the perfect belly flop maneuver that Gwendolyn had. He came in a little bit nose down, though that can be attributed to the loss of nitrogen in his RCS tanks. Of course, without nitrogen in the upper atmosphere, it's going to be very hard to get any air to move across those control surfaces, and it does not make it easy to come in for a perfect belly flop. Of course, we continue to have to ditch the plane in the ocean. We are not currently able to get this plane gliding far enough. But here we have the Tayen 5.5 on the Ahote 600 booster. This is going to be the last launch of an Ahote 600, and it is a bit of a sad day, as this was the booster that took us to orbit. Well, it didn't take us to orbit. I know the Ahote 400 took us to orbit, but for the purposes of this video, the Ahote 600 booster was the one that did most of our launches, and it's quite sad to see it go. I know that it's been kind of a workhorse of 1957, but all things must come to an end, and we're making way for a great booster to follow this one. The maximum payload of the Ahote 600 was approximately 50 kilograms, so that would be considered an ultralight launcher, and our satellites were not really made for actually it's impossible for us to make the most of that 50 kilograms considering our avionics limits and our battery limits and whatnot. So we did what we could on this launch, and we shed as much weight as possible that was unnecessary, and that began with the decoupler that decoupled the probe body. Instead of having a decoupling this probe body, we built the probe body around the final booster stage. And this was a test of our solar panel technology. Of course, it will be successful, and the Tayen 5.5 will do some good science here in orbit going forward. And here we are for the Kolowa X4 back with Ernest at the helm. This is his second flight of the year after having completed that first maiden voyage for the X4 plane. And now we have him pushing the boundaries with the X4. We are going to attempt to breach 110 kilometers on this flight. Now, you may think we already did that, we already accomplished that goal. However, some of the pencil pushers in our government's administration have determined that breaching 2 altitude records in one flight is not good enough. We have to show consistency and ensure that we can break those records every time. Of course, with a little bit of consistency comes a little bit of trial and error here, as we do not breach 110 kilometers on this flight. Unfortunately, I think the technique that Stacy used was just basically the limits of the X4 plane, and we are struggling now to complete that 110 kilometer contract, even after Stacy had completed 120 kilometers. Of course, we have slowly, incrementally pushed the plane a little bit closer to its final and intended landing site every time with the drop aircraft. And so we have Ernest here coming in for a well-planned landing. This time we have plenty of time and space, but catastrophic failure. The plane absolutely and spontaneously disassembles itself as we're coming down. Ernest loses consciousness for a moment before managing to eject himself and deploy his parachute. Ernest will definitely be getting a slap on the wrist for that one. And welcome back here with the next X4. It's been nearly 6 months since the last one flew. Of course, the administrators put a little bit of an expedited order on the next airframe. This time they have Gwendolyn Ross at the helm. They know she is very good at completing the contract set out for her, and nothing against Ernest, but they are a little bit wary, the administrators, after the last destruction of that plane. It wouldn't have been something that anybody else could have avoided, really, and it's not really going to show too badly on his record. But we have Gwendolyn here, and we know that she'll complete the contract perfectly. Of course, she manages to get the X4 above 110 kilometers here shortly, and performs a perfect dive back down to the surface. Of course, the landing will be a little bit nail-biting as always. While this is occurring, of course, the next generation of launchers was being rolled out onto the launch pad, and the X4 was coming in for a landing, and Gwyn probably got a good glance at the next launch vehicle out on the launch pad on Launch Complex Karuk. Of course, I will let you all just watch this landing and I'm sure that I grew at least one gray hair from this. This was very, very close. At a very high speed, Gwyn was coming down, and I had to bleed a lot of altitude and a lot of speed very quickly. So I'll let you all watch this amazing landing that Gwyn pulled off. And our next launch vehicle will be here shortly. All right, everybody. So here we are at the end of the episode. I must admit, I'm very pleased with my new launch vehicle. That was the KSP-1. Kuruk means bear, and I thought it was a little apt considering this amazing vehicle that I have developed here. It can throw nearly 1 ton, or just above 1 ton actually, into low Earth orbit, which I define as 250 kilometers altitude circularized. You could probably get even more, up to 150 kilometers altitude circularized, but all of my operations will probably be taking place around 250 kilometers going forward. It's just the way that it should operate. In real life, the atmosphere does extend out quite far. 140 kilometers and 150 kilometers is not nearly far enough out to avoid the worst effects of drag. But here we are watching the Tayen 7 in a perfect, really a highly elliptical orbit. Those last two solid rocket motors were designed to kick it up into an extremely elliptical orbit with around 40 kilometers in altitude, or around 40 kilometers in apoapsis altitude, and around 250 kilometers for the perigee. And don't ask about Tayen 6, who knows what happened to her. But anyways, I'll discuss this Kuruk more in the extras episode. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you enjoyed it, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And I will see you all in the next episode.